Welcome to the 51st Alfred M. Landon Lecture on Public Issues. The topic this morning, American Security and Energy Policy. Our guest, James R. Schlesinger, the nation's first Secretary of Energy, a post he held until August of 1979. Currently, Mr. Schlesinger divides his time between the Georgetown University Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he is a member of the executive board and a consultant in residence, and the investment banking firm of Lehman Brothers, Kuhn & Loeb Incorporated in New York, where he serves as a senior advisor. James Schlesinger became the first Secretary of Energy on August 5, 1977, taking the oath of office in a White House ceremony which came one day after President Carter had signed legislation creating the new cabinet agency. Mr. Schlesinger joined President Carter's staff in January of that year as assistant to the President, serving as principal energy advisor. He was charged with responsibility for drafting a national energy policy and a plan for the establishment of the Department of Energy to implement that policy. Mr. Schlesinger began his government service in 1969 as Assistant Director of the Bureau of the Budget. In August of '71, he became Chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, a post he held until February of 1973, when he was named Director of Central Intelligence. He served in that position until July of 1973, when he was appointed Secretary of Defense, and he remained at the Defense Department until November '75. Born in New York City, Mr. Schlesinger received the A.B., A.M., and Ph.D. degrees in economics from Harvard University. From 1955 to '63, he served as assistant and associate professor of economics at the University of Virginia. Subsequently, he was associated with the RAND Corporation as senior staff member and director of strategic studies. Mr. Schlesinger has been an associate editor of the Journal of Finance, a member of the Board of Associates of the Foreign Policy Research Institute at the University of Pennsylvania, and a Frederick Sheldon Prize Fellow at Harvard. He is author of The Political Economy of National Security and co-author of Issues in Defense Economics. To speak on American security and energy policy, I present to you James R. Schlesinger.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. It is a pleasure for me to be here today in Manhattan on this glorious spring day to deliver the Landon Lecture. My connection with Kansas State is not purely in the role of a lecturer, since my son studies here at an institution to which he nostalgically refers as Silo Tech. He also refers with some asperity to another institution known as Snob Hill. He assures me that he is learning calculus, statics, money and banking. I know from direct evidence that he has well learned to distinguish between the walleye and the crappie, all about lures, and the differences between the large and the smallmouth bass. Kansas State has grown up with this country, starting before the days of the Morrill Act, on which it wisely and quickly seized to become a land-grant college in 1863. And it is part of the American Midwest Kansas itself represents something of a microcosm of the American society. It has reflected, here in Kansas have been reflected all of America's troubles and all of America's strengths from the days of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Bleeding Kansas, the issue of whether the country would be slave or free. Kansas itself was a testing ground and a bloody testing ground of that issue. In populist days, it was the center of populist controversy from William Allen White, Mary Ellen Lease, and down through the development of the United States as the major force in world politics, which came about during the 1930s and 40s. When Kansas was isolationist, America was isolationist. And when Kansas became internationalist, so did America, and consequently the United States became, at that time, the greatest weight in world affairs. This was reflected, of course, in the career of the man for whom this series is named, Alfred Landon, who in himself reflects the indomitable spirit that is Kansas. When approached some time ago by a reporter asking whether he was still indulging in horseback riding, he replied, no, he had to give it up because his horse had gotten too old. It was these issues that were resolved in the 30s and 40s, as the United States had no alternative but to become the great protector of democratic values worldwide. We were reluctant to do it. We would have preferred to have remained disengaged. We would have preferred to remain the great arsenal of democracy rather than being directly involved. But there was no true alternative. And thus, as America became the pivot about which international affairs involved, it was at the time that Kansas itself had changed. Kansas represents the history of the Western movement, but more recently, in its role as a microcosm of the American society, it is a key part of the Western world. And this is appropriate, since until the unfortunate developments associated with the admission of Alaska and Hawaii, Kansas was the geographical center of the United States. Now, I mention this history for a number of reasons. It was Santayana who said that those who do not study history will be forced to repeat it. And recently, since I have broken my leg, I've had the opportunity to reread Gibbon's History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Not purely adventitiously. And I discovered somewhere a most appropriate comment in Gibbon. Somewhere in the 3rd century AD, the Romans began to follow the practice of paying blackmail to barbarian invaders. And they discovered that it was not an effective technique, as Gibbon says. And as soon as the apprehensions of war were removed, the infamy of the peace was more deeply and more sensibly felt. But the Romans were irritated to a still higher degree when they discovered that they had not even secured their repose, though at the expense of their honor. The dangerous secret of the wealth and weakness of the empire had been revealed to the world. New swarms of barbarians, encouraged by the success and not conceiving themselves bound by the obligation of their brethren, spread devastation through the provinces and terror as far as the gates of Rome. I cite that passage from Gibbon not as a prophecy, but simply as an admonition. It suggests the heartaches and the thousand natural shocks to which a great power may be heir as it begins to neglect its security. We are facing a new time of testing for the United States, a testing that reflects the interconnection between economics, energy supply on the one hand, and security considerations on the other. Americans have never had to worry about energy supply. Here in the United States, with its boundless resources, opened up by the westward movement to which I referred a moment ago, we have not been forced to contemplate the same risks that other great powers have been forced to reckon with. Britain, Germany were able to maintain their status as great powers, but had always to consider the issue of energy supply. It was the dominant motive for what the British referred to as their lifeline to the East, access to Middle Eastern crude. Until the early 1970s, the United States never had serious energy dependency on external sources of supply. And therefore, it could ignore, to a large extent, the intimate connection between national security and energy supply. From the close of World War II, under the aegis of American power, the world went through an extraordinary period of economic expansion based upon cheap and abundant energy increasingly exploited at long distances, and also on the protective umbrella of American strength. It was a period we sometimes refer to as Pax Americana. Under the umbrella of American power, the world had an extraordinary expansion of international trade and investment, of growth, of living standards, by and large on a worldwide basis, all due to the framework of security provided by the United States, and at the same time due to cheap and abundant energy. Both of those premises of this extraordinary period of expansion are questionable today. The United States, partly inevitably, partly because of its own neglect, has allowed its international position to erode so that we no longer have that framework of security. And, not entirely disconnected, we face increasing problems with respect to energy supply, not only volume and price, but security and access as well. Thus, since 1945, the United States has faced two inconsistent trends. First, a growing dependency upon foreign sources of supply, indeed in the ultimate located in the most volatile region of the world, subject close to the sources of Soviet power, subject to interdiction through a variety of mechanisms. And as its dependency gradually rose, its ability to protect its international position shrank with the decline of its defense posture relative to the Soviet Union. It is these conflicting trends that I want to discuss today. The pianist Jose Iturbe was once asked whether he needed to practice. And he responded, this is an excellent story, I think, for an academic setting. He responded that he had to practice. On the first day, he noticed the difference. On the second day, the critics noticed the difference. And on the third day, the public noticed the difference. And our problem internationally is that we have been living on borrowed time. Indeed, we have reached, as the good book would say, the morning and the evening of the fourth day. We are dependent, America and the free world, upon the resources of the Persian Gulf. There should be no illusion on this question, and it has been commonplace in American life for there to be illusion that somehow or other, through the waving of some wand, we could change this quickly and easily. We cannot. The OPEC nations possess 82% of the world's proven reserves of oil, and that percentage is tending to rise rather than fall. Oil reserves being drawn down more rapidly outside of OPEC than within OPEC. Each day down through the Straits of Hormuz move 20 million barrels of oil, some 60% of all the oil flowing in international commerce, 40% of all of the oil consumed in the free world. And that is increasingly vulnerable for a variety of reasons. America has assumed that it had the luxury of choice with regard to energy supply. I'm glad to see the students of the American Nuclear Society here today, because we have assumed that we had the luxury of choice whether or not we would use coal or nuclear power or liquefied natural gas, or whether we were willing to strip mine coal. Dozens of issues on which we've decided on the basis that we wanted to avoid the costs of doing something. We cannot afford to defer the substitution of alternative sources of energy for the use of oil, which is increasingly in limited supply in the United States, and increasingly we become more dependent upon external sources of supply. There are no panaceas, not project independence, not deregulation. They may be helpful. Synfuels is not a panacea. It may be helpful. It may provide us with some additional supply by the year 1990. But for the foreseeable future, the United States will remain dependent upon external sources of supply. And from that comes a political vulnerability. But it is a lesser political vulnerability for the United States in her role as a nation than in her role as leader of the free world. Because irrespective of our own efforts, Western Europe and Japan will remain dependent upon the oil resources of the Persian Gulf region inevitably. 70% of their fuel, of their oil, will come from that region. As a consequence, we are now in grave danger of a loss of control over the destinies of the free world. As if the Soviet Union comes to control the oil tap in the Middle East, it will imply the end of the free world as we have known it since 1945. Japan and Western Europe, under those conditions, would have no alternative but to reach accommodations with the Soviet Union, which would then be in control of the economic future of both of these industrialized areas. It implies that the security of supply in the Persian Gulf cannot be compromised if we are to preserve the structure of international politics as we have known that structure since 1945. And as we look at conditions as they have emerged in the last 3 years, there is no reason for complacency. Indeed, quite bluntly, the United States is in the most perilous position that it has been since the darkest days of World War II. And yet it is not obvious. It is not as obvious as something like the attack on Pearl Harbor. But in the Middle East, on which the free world depends, the strategic momentum is moving against the United States. Today, unquestionably, the strategic momentum is possessed by the Soviet Union. One welcomes, but one should not overrate the importance of the resistance resistance in Afghanistan. The Soviet Union has, in recent years, possessed the strategic momentum, and more importantly, the position of the United States has been declining and continues to decline today. It is for that reason that we face grave peril. Let me remind you of some of the elements of this deterioration. In the spring of 1977, Ethiopian and Cuban forces under Soviet generals established the preponderance of the Soviet Union in the Horn of Africa. In the spring of 1978, there was the Tariki revolution in Afghanistan. At that time, the Soviets ran lines of communication into Afghanistan similar to those that they have in the East European satellites. And Afghanistan effectively became, in 1978, not in December 79, a satellite of the Soviet Union. Indeed, the Afghanis changed their national symbol to the red flag. And any Muslim state that adopts the red flag as a national symbol is telling us something. In the summer of 1978, there were the simultaneous murders of two chiefs of state of the two Yemens to the south in the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula, to the south of the monarchies that provide us with most of our oil, resulting in the increased role of South Yemen as a Soviet satellite and a weakened resistance on the part of North Yemen to incursion. All through 1978, the Shah teetered on his throne and ultimately fell early in 79. The Shah was the linchpin of U.S. policy in the Middle East. Whatever the retrospective judgments of the Shah may be, he was the linchpin. And the fall of the Shah was a cataclysm for U.S. foreign policy. The fall of the Shah represented the final end of the Northern Tier. The Northern Tier, a belt of nations, Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, established by the Baghdad Pact of 1954 and CENTO, as a protective shield to prevent Soviet movement southward to the Persian Gulf. 20 years before, the Western world's dependency on the Persian Gulf reached the peak that it has now reached. Pakistan, in 1978, decided to shift its premier ambassador from the embassy in Washington to the embassy in Moscow, based on a judgment that they would have to work out their destinies with the Soviet Union rather than the United States. Turkey, of course, was alienated from the United States by the decision of the U.S. Congress to cut off military assistance, reflecting developments in Cyprus. Turkey also suffering from grave economic difficulties, largely induced by the rising price of oil, which Turkey could not afford. So with the collapse of the Shah, there was the collapse of the northern tier. That was sufficient disaster. But a year later, we were in even greater difficulty as the deterioration went on. It moved across the Gulf into the Arabian Peninsula itself. 3/4 of the oil moving down through the Straits of Hormuz comes from the west side of the Gulf, and notably from Saudi Arabia, that now supplies 1/3 of all the oil in OPEC. And Saudi Arabia today is in graver circumstances than heretofore. I want to be very delicate about that. We have not been willing to face the implications for the United States and for the Western world of a collapse in Saudi Arabia. But we must recognize what has occurred there. The event, the attack on the Grand Mosque in Mecca, was a most serious development. It went undetected by Saudi intelligence. It took a better part of 3 weeks for Saudi security forces to suppress that attack. It was not the action of religious fanatics, so-called. It was a well-rehearsed, well-orchestrated event carried out by well-trained men, probably drawing their inspiration from South Yemen. And the Saudi family draws its legitimacy from being the protector of the holy places, so that its legitimacy was undermined by its apparent inability to protect the holy sites. At the same time, there was disorder in the eastern provinces. There is a higher sensitivity to the issue of corruption in Saudi Arabia today in the wake of the rise of Khomeini in Iran than there was previously, a fact recently acknowledged by Crown Prince Fahd himself. The troubles continue to grow. There are indications, there have been press indications that the Saudis have permitted Soviet overflights of Saudi Arabia to resupply South Yemen. In the spring of last year, the United States rushed arms, $378 million worth of arms, to North Yemen when it was under attack by South Yemen. This year, North Yemen is shifting toward the Soviet orbit and has entered into conversations on prospective union with South Yemen. Now, a year ago, after the collapse of the northern tier, the Saudi press began to talk about the Soviet onslaught and the passivity of the United States in the face of that onslaught. The Saudis, once again, on whom, the Saudis and the other conservative monarchies, on whom we depend for our oil, face what they regard as encirclement. It is for these reasons that I stress the peril in which we are today, in contrast to the obvious consequences of something like Pearl Harbor. It is not fully recognized by the American people. But it is an issue, just as in 1941, that transcends politics. It is an issue of survival of where the United States is likely to be. Now, I submit it is time for emergency action. I do not have the time at this juncture to develop at any length what should be done. Let me just run through a number, briefly, of items. First, we must address the issue of the balance of power in the Indian Ocean. We will not survive based on others' judgments as to the purity of our motives. Our survival will depend upon the maintenance of a balance of power. And the balance of power in the Indian Ocean has moved adversely to the United States. The Soviet Union today possesses an order of battle north of the Iranian border and in Afghanistan that makes the Soviet Union the dominant military force in the region. The grain embargo, the boycott, make Americans feel a lot better, but they remain strategically marginal. They do not affect what is critical, which is the balance of power in the region. We must redress that, and we must take steps immediately so to do. In the first place, I believe a major element of the American fleet must be permanently deployed into the Indian Ocean, including major components of the Marine Corps. It will require a permanent base structure. It will not be done occasionally by surging carrier task forces into the Indian Ocean. We may think that the signal that we are sending is America's capacity to be on the scene, but the signal that is gathered by the relatively weak governments of the region is the American fleet disappearing over the horizon when it withdraws. We must be permanently there and seen to be permanently there. Rapid deployment forces, while welcome, are insufficient. Rapid deployment forces will still be insufficient at that time in the middle 1980s when they can rapidly be deployed. Until that time, they are not available. So the first thing that must be done is a redressing of the balance of power, recognizing that ultimately we will require for an appropriate deterrent land-based forces in the region. Secondly, in my judgment, we must revitalize the American intelligence community. It should not require a long national debate. The events of recent years in the Middle East have demonstrated, I believe, the weaknesses of our intelligence analyses and collection, but more clearly, the destruction of our capacity for counterintelligence and the virtual destruction of our capacity for covert operations. These developments in the Middle East might well not have occurred or occurred to the same degree if we had an effective intelligence agency. The practice of self-flagellation is not confined to Shiite Muslims in the month of Muharram. Here in the United States, we have been indulging in self-flagellation at least for the last 5 years, much of it at the expense of the intelligence community. It is time to end that debate and revitalize our intelligence arm. Let me say that a so-called legislative charter is not the path to revitalization. A legislative charter represents more restrictions, and more restrictions by any other name are simply more restrictions. Thirdly, we are going to have to restore grant military assistance. As the United States reduced its own military forces and began to depend on indigenous local forces, for some reason we phased out grant military assistance. So now this great power is in the undignified position of begging the oil-rich countries of the Middle East, such as the Saudis, for cash to provide military equipment to friendly states. It is not appropriate for the United States either to be in that position of begging support from other nations or lending to states such as Pakistan at essentially usurious rates of interest that they cannot afford. So we will have to restore grant military assistance. In addition, we will require to deal with two longer-term matters. These three things that I've mentioned can be done essentially now. We will be required to face the issue of defense expenditures, not by maneuvering the budget once again, but facing reality. The United States is now being outspent by the Soviet Union in terms of expenditures by at least 50%, in terms of military investment by 100%, that is the acquisition of military hardware. The consequence of that, cumulatively, year after year, will be to leave the Soviet Union with a force posture twice the size of that of the United States. Indeed, the Soviet Union, we sometimes comfort ourselves by saying that we have better allies than the Soviets have, which we do. The Soviet Union is outspending on military investment all of the Western nations and their Asian allies, including Japan. And this is affecting the balance of power. If the United States is to compete in the 1980s and 90s with the Soviet Union, it will have to redress the issue of military expenditures. And finally, we will need to have a foreign policy which is regarded as firm, stalwart, steadfast by nations in the Middle East and elsewhere. The United States being seen as a nation that was prepared to be supportive of its friends and dangerous to oppose rather than highly unpredictable. During the course of the last decade, it has become downright perilous to be a third world ally of the United States. And this is reflected in the attitude of most of the nations in the region. These are the requirements, I think, that are imposed upon us by the great change that occurred in America's role in the world coming out of the 1930s and 40s, to which Governor Landon made his contribution. There is no substitute for the United States in world politics in terms of the defense of freedom. There is no other nation that can serve as a counterweight to Soviet power. If we fail to do it, there is no substitute. What the events in the Middle East do is to tell us that time is running out, that we must act now before time runs out. History will not forgive us if we fail to do so. Now, what I have said is severe, somewhat gloomy. So I recount in closing the observation of an American intelligence officer, which may have some bearing on this problem. At the time, in 1941, as he looked over the wreckage at Pearl Harbor, and he said, "We're going to win this war, I know that. But God bless my soul if I know how." I think that it combines optimism, an American optimism, in the face of continuing difficulties. We must recognize that the decade of the 80s is likely to be a perilous one, and that we must organize ourselves if we are effectively to protect freedom not only here in the North American continent, but around the world as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schlesinger. We'll have a few questions, but before that, I would like to have you meet the platform party. On your left, Dr. Barry Flinchbaugh, who is chairman of the Landon Lecture series. Mr. Bob Wilson, chairman of the Landon Patrons. On your right, Mr. Randy Tosh, the student body president at Kansas State. And for the first time on this platform, your president-elect of the Faculty Senate, Dr. Charles Hathaway. Dr. Schlesinger, I am certain that there will be a few questions. It's about 11:15. We want to give the opportunity for those who need to excuse themselves for their 11:30 classes. And then we'll call your attention to the microphones on the right or the left. And let's see, are there microphones in the gallery? We at least have microphones here on the right or the left on the main floor. And now we have time for questions. On your left, the first question for Mr. Schlesinger.
Mr. Schlesinger, I understand the Soviet Union is 20 years advanced in the space race. Could you explain that? And something about the assault and the 1972 ballistic signings between Brezhnev and Nixon?
The questions are addressed to where the Soviet Union stands in the space race and about the SALT agreements 1972 and the prospective SALT II and the agreement that has been reached, SALT II, with the prospective ratification or non-ratification. Is that it?
More or less, but I was more interested in, I understand that they don't want to have a Pearl Harbor in space.
Did you say whether there'll be a Pearl Harbor in space?
Yes.
There will not be, I believe. The problem with the Soviet Union is not that they are ahead of us in technology. They are not. And if we are careful, they will remain behind us in most relevant areas for the decades ahead. The problem with the Soviet Union is not the attractiveness of the society or the efficacy of the political system. It is one and simple thing that the Soviet Union, the Soviet leadership, has placed the principal emphasis upon the acquisition of military power. That military power passes well beyond issues of space and of strategic armaments. It involves very considerably around the periphery of the Soviet Union, the borderlands of free Asia and free Europe, conventional military forces. The Soviet Union has been outproducing us in terms of tanks by 5-1. It maintains 170 divisions, Army divisions to the U.S. 16. It is in a position in which they have narrowed the gap with regard to the efficacy of their tactical aircraft as opposed to those of the United States. We still maintain a considerable advantage in TAC air, but only it is now narrowed. And this is the area in which military force can be effectively applied. The fact of the space struggle tells you two things. First, that the Soviets did not have the technology that the United States had. Secondly, that it did not care to pour its resources into this area because it saw relatively low rates of return in terms of national well-being of the Soviet Union. By contrast, it has poured resources into the development of strategic arms which for a decade have been 3 times the resources that the United States has been putting into it. That brings us to SALT II. The SALT agreements have been designed essentially to channel the arms competition between the two powers, but have not as yet reduced the pace of that competition. Right after the SALT I agreement in May of '72, the Soviet Union virtually exploded with the development or the revealing of new weapon systems, strategic weapon systems that it had under development. SALT II is primarily a political issue between the two countries, and I think that it should be judged as a political issue. Will it serve to allow the United States to maintain the balance of power, to maintain its military posture relative to the Soviet Union, or will it serve to lure the American public, to lull the American public once again into believing that these kinds of paper agreements by themselves are satisfactory? I fear, though I do not know, that the answer is the latter, that the passage of SALT II would indeed serve to lull the American people into believing that our problems, our strategic problems, are over and would cause us to let down our guard. However, I think that this is an issue that can be resolved by firmness on the part of the Congress and the President in terms of the projection of the future forces of the United States. Sir.
First of all, I'd like to say thanks, because last year during our high school debate season, I ended up quoting you profusely, and it's very nice to hear from you live. Anyhow, the question that came up to my mind is, with the inflation running at about 18%, and with the certain amount of oil that we're importing, how big of a role do these importations of oil actually play on the economy today? And if you could answer this other question is, will we ever be able to bring inflation down to maybe 8% or maybe even lower?
Yeah, I think that inflation is going to come down substantially. And indeed, interest rates have already topped out. I believe the rate of inflation is topping out. I do not know whether you will regard the cure of this disease as any more satisfactory than the disease itself, but we are heading into what I regard as a sharp recession, in which you will find unemployment rising towards the level of 7.5%, 8% by election day, and possibly touching 10% early in the new year. And the effect of that recession will be to pull down, at least temporarily, the rise in prices, probably down into the 10 or 11% as opposed to the 18 or 20%. Beyond that, it is a question of whether the United States can restore, in part, its capacity to have large increases in productivity. In recent years, productivity gains in the United States have approached zero. Indeed, in the last quarter went below zero. And productivity is inversely related to inflation. Quite obviously, we can live with the level of oil imports that we presently have. It is painful. We, the United States, not other countries necessarily. The United States dollar is still the preeminent currency in the world. The countries that are most ill-served by the rise in oil prices, not the industrial countries, but the countries in the third world. Countries like Brazil that had a substantial rate of progress going and then were partially crippled by this rise in oil prices. And countries like Turkey, which I mentioned before, which has been thrown more or less into the position of being a basket case. The United States is able to carry this level of oil imports. It is a lower level of oil imports than is carried by Japan or Germany, proportionate to the gross national product. It will be painful. It will increase inflationary pressures, but we can do it. Sir?
Do you believe that the Soviet Union will militarily go after the oil in the Middle East, or do you think they'll try to blackmail the countries in the Middle East by threatening force?
I know that they will do and are doing the latter. I do not know what they plan to do about the former, or whether they have any plans at all. My judgment is that the Soviet Union does not have a blueprint. It does not have a grand strategy. It is a cautious but opportunistic power. If it sees opportunities, it is likely to seize them. It is undoubtedly, and has been for a year and a half, attempting to put into place in Iran the infrastructure for a leftist takeover. And that effort is succeeding. It has an effective pawn in South Yemen, and that is part of this encirclement process. We don't know, and there's no evidence that the Soviets had any role in sponsoring the movement against the Grand Mosque. But we know that the Soviet Union is active. Just because the United States, in this burst of ultra-morality, decided that it is best to give up covert operations, does not mean that all other great powers in the world will have a similar feeling of self-indulgence and self-control. The Soviets are out there today. The balance of power will affect how they react militarily, and the next generation of Soviet leaders will determine that in part. Remember, we are dealing with a very conservative set of Soviet leaders. Happily, we are dealing with a conservative set of Soviet leaders. They are cautious. Every one of them has in his bones the feeling of the Germans at the gates of Moscow. That was a very searing experience, and they are reacting cautiously. The problem is that the next generation, and these are men in their 70s, the next generation of Soviet leaders will be men now in their late 40s and early 50s who don't have the memories of World War II, who may not be as cautious, and who will be far more sensitive to the indices of power. So I don't know the answer to whether or not the Soviets would overtly use military force in the absence of a grand opportunity presented to them. They will not refrain from the use of military force on principle, however, and therefore we are well advised to maintain a balance of power. Sir.
Yes, Dr. Schlesinger. In our country, we are seeing a movement towards decentralization and self-sufficiency. This in regard to the whole spectrum of American lifestyle, whether it be energy or food distribution, health service, and so forth. Could not such a model of decentralization inform American international policy, or are we beyond that?
Briefly, the answer is we are beyond that. Indeed, I think that while one welcomes the local initiatives in government, the individual actions that result in a higher degree of decentralization, and no democracy can work well as a centralized, depending entirely upon centralized power. It's just inherently inconsistent with the meaning of democracy. While we welcome all of that, we ought not to exaggerate the consequences for the United States. The United States is, to a large degree, still run by national institutions, national political institutions, national corporations, national policymakers in Washington, and national labor unions. This may be tempered by the growth of local initiatives, individual initiatives, but it will not be ended. And similarly, on the international scene, there is no substitute for the United States. Would that there were. But the powers that protected this country in the 1930s Britain, France, that were out there skirmishing in the early days of World War II, no longer have the power to do that. The Soviet Union has, in the course of the last 5 years, become a global power that only the United States has the power to balance. If we fail to do that, the consequences for the free world and for the local initiatives, which you mentioned, would be catastrophic. There is no substitute for the United States internationally.